pre-vegetation or pre-construction plant surveys that we do anytime a new trail is proposed in our parks. So just a little bit of background about trails at MetroParks. We have about 16,000 acres across our agency, and within that amount of land, we have 270 miles of trails. So that includes hiking trails, that includes paved bikeways, that includes mountain biking, equestrian, and paddling trails. So that's a lot of trails, and we have more miles of trails planned. And there's a couple things that are driving this desire for more trails. Some of that is based on our park usage metrics, so how many people are visiting our parks, do we have the appropriate amount of mileage for that? Also, we look at the population that surrounds each park. So do we have the appropriate amount of mileage for the people that live around there? Our comprehensive master plan, which is kind of a 10-year plan for growth at our agency, calls for more bikeway connections between parks and also more trails at our parks. And then the biggest driver for more trails are you guys, the public. So we've done surveys on which facilities that we offer are the most important to the public. And overwhelmingly, the answer is always trails. So the top two answers here are nature and hiking trails and paved biking trails. So we have all of these additional miles of trails planned, but we want to make sure that we're building these in a sustainable way for the environment, because we know that trails impact the natural environment. So we just heard about how trails might impact wildlife. Trails also impact plants, and they impact the soil of that habitat. So these are just a couple examples of some trails in our MetroParks that have, this one here, it has what we call incision. So that's essentially where the trail has been walked so many times, that soil is so compacted that the level of your trail is much lower than the actual ground level. In the middle picture here, we have trail widening. That's when folks are walking around, usually a muddy patch, but they're trampling all that vegetation on the side and really widening the footprint of that trail beyond what it was intended to be. And then in the last photo, we have some trail erosion. So if trails are built incorrectly or unsustainably, especially on slopes, that really increases erosion issues, which not only damages the soil, but also the plants, everything in the surrounding area. When we have trails with stream crossings, that also has all kinds of negative impacts. You're compacting the soil of the stream bed and the surrounding banks. You're also damaging that sensitive riparian vegetation. And if you're walking through that water, you're kicking up sediment and you're increasing the sedimentation input into that water system, which is decreasing water quality, and it's going to affect aquatic communities. And lastly, trails are a mechanism for invasive species spread. So whether you're walking through an invasive ground cover, or you're brushing up against plants that have seeds on them, and you're tracking that into the rest of the habitat, and potentially out with you and into other areas. So what can we as trail users do to minimize our impact? The previous talk did a really good job covering some of these things. So staying on the path, this is a photo at Allwood in peak spring ephemeral season. Could you imagine if folks were just walking into all of these beautiful bluebells and just really trampling all of that vegetation? Keeping your pets on leashes, so they're also not trampling vegetation and they're not impacting wildlife. Removing seeds from your boots and your clothes before and after you're hiking, so that you're not bringing invasive species in or taking them out with you. And then most importantly, practicing leave no trace. So don't take anything in that you don't bring out. And oppositely, don't take anything out that you didn't bring in. So what do we do as an agency to try and minimize the impact that our trails have on the natural environment? Well, that is the purview of our trail committee. So this committee was formed in 2005, and their mission is to ensure that MetroParks trails provide safe, consistent, and high-quality experiences for visitors with varied interests and levels of ability in a manner that protects natural resources and habitats. So this committee is comprised of folks from all different departments. We have all three of our pillars at MetroParks represented. We have conservation, education, recreation. Our trail crew obviously is on this committee. And folks from our planning and projects department are on this committee. And what this committee does is they establish the standards for trail installation, for trail maintenance, and trail repairs. And then the biggest thing that they do is evaluate trail proposals. So anytime a park manager or a trail manager wants to put in a new trail, whether that be a totally new trail or just a reroute of a previous section of trail, they have to submit a trail proposal. And that proposal gets evaluated by our committee. And if that proposal is approved, that falls in our realm in conservation to do our pre-vegetation surveys. So historically, there's always been some sort of way of evaluating these trails, but there really wasn't a formal or a consistent method from trail to trail. And so in 2021, our managers in conservation and Lisa, our biologist, got together and developed this protocol to evaluate plant communities before any new trail is installed. And what this protocol does is it provides us really quantifiable results of how a trail is going to impact plant communities. And it also is an unbiased way of assessing the plants. Because what we do is we inventory all of the species of plants within that trail corridor. And then we cross-reference them against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Ohio Division of Natural Resources rare plant lists. So this includes our threatened, our endangered, extirpated, and locally rare plants. So you're probably familiar with threatened and endangered classifications, but you might not know about locally rare plants. So this is a classification for plants that is assigned by state botanists, and this is assigned per county. So this is a list of plants that they're not threatened or endangered. They are more common in other places, but for whatever reason in our county, they're not common, they're locally rare. This could be because they're declining locally. Could be due to urbanization. It could be because we're at the edge of their historic range and they just have never been very common here. But for whatever reason, they just are locally rare in Montgomery County. And these are all species that are important for preservation of diversity and also because they provide important ecological processes. Okay, so let's talk about the actual protocol of the survey that we do. So anytime a new trail is proposed, that proposal comes to us and we conduct a year-long review of the plant communities where that trail is going to go. And so we've determined based on some previous research that we've done that there are really 4 time periods of the year that we need to be surveying in to identify all of the plants that would grow in that area within a year. And so those time frames are for spring ephemerals, we do a survey sometime between March 15th and April 15th. For summer plants, we do May 15th through July 1st. For our fall plants, we do any time during the month of October. And then if we're in an area where there's a high likelihood that we have winter orchids, we would do a December or January survey. And so the first thing we do for our survey is we have our trail manager go out and actually flag the exact route where he intends for the trail to go. And he'll usually do this with flagging tape or pin flags or something. And then we come out and we set up these 20 by 20 foot quadrants the entire length of that trail. The reason we chose 20 by 20 foot quadrants, so we do 10 feet on either side of the center line of that trail, and then 20 feet down. And so that is to assess plants around where the trail is going to be, because we know trails don't just impact the footprint where they're going to be, they can also impact the surrounding areas. And also that gives us a little bit of wiggle room. If we do have a defined population of rare plants, and we need to shift the trail this way slightly to avoid that, we've already surveyed the plants in that area, and so we can do that. So once we have our quadrants set up, we go to every single one, and we identify all of the plant species that we found in that quadrant. And we also estimate the number of each species. We take that list, and we cross-reference the ODNR or plant lists to see if we got threatened, endangered, or locally rare plants. And then we look up their C of C value. So C of C stands for coefficient of conservatism. This is a 0 through 10 value that is assigned to all native plants by state botanists. And this value essentially tells you how sensitive that plant is. So the lower the number, the less sensitive, the more of a generalist that plant can be. It has super broad habitat requirements. But the higher your number gets, the closer to 10, the more sensitive that plant is to any sort of disturbance. And those plants tend to have a very narrow habitat tolerance. So if you think of your wetland plants that can't grow anywhere else but in a wetland, those are going to have high CFC values. We then run some analysis and present all of that information to our trail committee. So we provide them a full species list of every single plant that we found. We tell them how many native species we found versus how many invasive species. And then we let them know if we found any rare plants. We also do some breakdowns by quadrant. So we'll provide which quadrants have the highest and lowest biodiversity. And we'll also provide a graphic like this that shows how that biodiversity changes over time. So with those plots that have really high biodiversity, like in here, we might want to consider shifting that trail slightly. We also will let them know which quadrants have the highest invasive pressure and what those invasive species are. And lastly, we provide any specific recommendations that our team has for that trail installation, which include if we think any native plant mitigation should occur if that trail gets installed, and also how staff should be managing invasive species in all points of construction and afterwards. So when I say native plant mitigation, I'm talking about supplemental plantings or seedings. So after that trail is completed, coming in with plant plugs or plant seed in the surrounding area to really try and keep that species in that habitat. We also can talk about keeping native plant seed-rich soil on site. So a lot of times they have to do topsoil scraping or some sort of excavation to put that trail tread in. And if we're in an area where there's very high spring ephemeral presence, we want to keep that soil with all that seed in it. So we'll just put that into surrounding areas. We also can think about native plant mitigation from a reforestation perspective. So not all of our trail proposals are like brand new trails. A lot of times they're reroutes of a section of old trail that we want to remove for one reason or another. And so sometimes we'll recommend, if it's a reroute, that we do some native plant mitigation in that old section of trail by coming in and planting trees and shrubs to kind of fill in that forest canopy gap, and also to keep people from still trying to walk that old section of trail. All right, so I just want to kind of walk through some results and show you how we would pick which native plants we would mitigate for. So these are some results from a trail reroute that we did at Wittenberg MetroPark. So the first thing we do is we parse out our natives versus our invasive species. And then once we have those natives, we want to look for which native plants did we find in a super low abundance the entire length of that trail reroute. And then we'll compare that with their C of C values. So obviously higher C of C values, those are sensitive plants. Those are ones we want to think about mitigating. And so in this case, we chose 3 species to mitigate. They all have a C of C value of 6. And Wright columbine and wild petunia are really great spring ephemerals. They're great for pollinators, so we definitely wanted to mitigate those. Pawpaw, there was only one individual, so we thought that that would be a great species to come in and plug in the decommissioned section of trail. But I do want to mention, why didn't we pick the the sycamore that is the highest CFC value. Well, those sycamores were large, mature trees. This is a single width natural surface hiking trail. We don't need to cut down large mature trees for a hiking trail. They can just route around it. So it's things like that that we take into consideration when making these recommendations. We also think about, are we going to be able to actually find that plant or grow that plant to mitigate for it? And do we have seed on site for that? Things like that. Okay, so what about invasive species management from these surveys? Well, we just have got a full list of all of the invasive species in the area. So now we can start to plan maybe what species we want to prioritize, what areas we want to start in. Is there any special equipment or herbicide or time of year that we need to be targeting these species? Kind of opposite from our native plant seed-rich soil, if we have very heavy invasive species, there's going to be a lot of seed in that soil, and that's something we definitely don't want to take off-site and use other places, because then we're just spreading the problem to other parks. And then lastly, we know that soil disturbance really exacerbates invasive problems for years. That brings all of these new seeds to the surface, and if you've removed the invasives already above the soil surface to put in this trail, now these seeds have plenty of sunlight, they have no competition, they're really just gonna take off, and you're gonna have a much bigger problem than maybe you did initially. So because we know this, we can work with parks to kind of schedule out these treatments for seasons or years to come to really keep up on these problems. Okay, so these are some invasive species results, again, from that Inglewood survey. This is a half-a-mile reroute section. And as you can see, we have the entire rainbow of invasive species. Pretty much the entire length of the trail. So targeting all of these species in every single area at once is not feasible for our staff or for park staff. So we need to kind of prioritize which species are we going to go for first. And so, starting here at the bottom in yellow, we have lesser celandine. If you're not familiar with that plant, it is a really aggressive ground cover that pops up late winter, early spring, right about now, and it just takes over anywhere it is, pretty much. Really outcompetes our native spring ephemerals, and this plant spreads super aggressively. It spreads by seed, it spreads by tubers, it spreads by leaf or stem cuttings. So if you walk through this and it gets on your shoes, you're just gonna spread little footprints of celandine with you. And that's something we don't want. So obviously that's a top priority. That one was only in 2 quadrants, but unfortunately those quadrants were the entrance and the exit to our trail. So obviously we don't want people walking through that. So that's definitely a priority for treatment. In purple, we called out another species that is Ailanthus, or tree of heaven. That's an invasive tree that is also the host plant to an invasive insect. We don't want either of those things here, so definitely want to get those out. And those have a really special treatment method. You can't cut that tree. It has a super high stress response. So if a tree is damaged in any way, one individual will send out 10 or 20 root suckers. And so one problem tree very quickly becomes 258 individual trees in a very small area. So we definitely wanted to target that. In blue, we have honeysuckle. Found that everywhere. No surprise, honeysuckles everywhere around here. Again, that's not feasible to treat all of that, so we call out this area specifically because those were the most biodiverse quadrants. So getting the honeysuckle out of there and then kind of working outwards is the way to go here. And then lastly in red, we had buckthorn. There were only 2 individual trees, so that's super low hanging fruit. We can just cut those down and be done with it. So that's why that one was called out. These trails look at plants. They don't really necessarily study wildlife, but if we do come across wildlife while we're doing a survey, we note that and we let the trail committee know what we saw. So this guy here is a box turtle, eastern box turtle. We found that at a survey at Carriage Hill. And that guy was directly on the center line of the trail where it was gonna go. So we want to think about, are we impacting important wildlife sites by putting this trail in? For a box turtle, those have a very small home range of generally about a half acre to an acre. And they don't leave that area their entire life. So if we put a trail directly through that, what kind of impact is that going to have? Box turtles are a species of concern in Ohio, so it's definitely something to think about. For these turtles, a natural surface hiking trail probably is not going to impact them that much. They can cross trails. But what about less mobile species like salamanders? This is a handful of salamanders that we found at Inglewood. Salamanders are shown to be much less likely to cross trails, even if it's a single track natural surface trail. They're just not as mobile. And so if we put this trail in, it might be separating where the salamanders live from really important breeding sites like vernal pools or ponds or streams. How is that going to affect salamander populations? All of these things we want to consider when we do these trail surveys and when we present to our trail committee. So far, with this new protocol, we have done 7 trail surveys. That equates to several miles of new trail. Of those 7 surveys, 4 of them have been approved. One of them is already complete. It's a reroute of, I believe, the Pink Trail at Germantown. One of those is currently in the construction process. That is the Green Trail at Inglewood. We've had 2 of those surveys and 2 of those trail proposals that were declined by the trail committee after we presented these results. Those were declined for their impact of some locally rare plants. And then we have 1 trail survey that's in the final review process with our trail committee. We've found hundreds and hundreds of plants. I don't have an exact number of species, but it was somewhere around 600 species of plants that we've identified since doing these trail surveys. And 75% of those species have actually been native plants, which I know sometimes we get bogged down with the invasive species and how much of them there are. But when we're doing these surveys, 75%, at least of our species list, maybe not of abundance, but at least of what we're finding, are native plants, which is really great. We have found 1 wildlife species of concern, that's that box turtle. And then we have found 7 locally rare plants. Those plants are here. So we have eastern red columbine. This one is maple leaf viburnum. This is a large twig blade orchid. Skunk cabbage, wild hyacinth, running strawberry bush, and southern adder's tongue. And then I just wanted to share some other really cool photos that we've taken of stuff we saw during a trail survey. So we have our box turtle, cute little garter snake, ghost pipes, which are a parasitic plant, so super neat. And then my favorite insect, the Luna moth. These trail surveys are super important for us to get out and survey the vegetation. But they're also just a really fun way for us to get out and see super cool stuff that not a lot of people get to see. And lastly, shameless plug, if you're interested in helping with trail surveys like this in the future, or for a similar project, it's called cover mapping. I put a QR code here. If you're not already a volunteer, you can scan that, and it'll take you to our webpage to become a volunteer. We have a cover mapping training coming up mid-April. If you're interested in joining that, that is also kind of a bio-assessment, plant assessment type of opportunity. And then we also have Adopt a Park projects on April 26th if you would like to join us for that. I included my email if you have any questions that you don't think of right now. Feel free to reach out. And with that, thank you, and I will take any questions you have. Yeah.
The tree of heaven thing,
Mm-hmm.
if you cut that down, it spreads?
Yep.
Holy crap.
You're expecting more now?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
Yeah, we've struggled with that one for a long time. Even if you cut it and you treat it, They just will be sending up root suckers for years.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So how do you mitigate that?
That is one, we have a couple different treatment methods for that. So if it's small enough, you can foliar spray it, and that'll kill it. For the larger ones, we do, there's 2 different methods we use. One of them is called basal barking. So that's where you have a special oil mixture chemical and you spray it on the trunk of the tree. And it slowly absorbs into the tree and essentially kills it without it realizing that it's dying. So it doesn't send up,
It's a side effect.
sometimes they still send up 1 or 2 root suckers, but, and then the other method is lancing, so that's where we're injecting herbicide directly into the tree. That also kind of tricks it into thinking it's dying. Hack and squirt, yeah. I use that one very often. Yeah,
For the other uses, do you do like a cut and paint or like a cut and removal?
yes.
And then with that, how have you found the best way to remove the like cut part where it won't grow somewhere else?
That's a good question. So when we're cutting, we treat the stumps won't resprout. And then the edge of the part that you cut calluses over pretty quickly. Sometimes I have seen honeysuckle like re-root into the ground once you cut it, but for the most part, if you pile it up into a brush pile and try to keep those ends off of the ground, they're much less likely to re-root into the ground. We do a lot of cut and treat. For honeysuckle, we'll do foliar sprays mostly, so that just kind of kills it while it's standing. Yeah.
So your story is, it's not resource intensive. Is it
Yes.
manageable for the amount of trail work you want to do?
So we only do the survey part. We don't do the trail construction, any of that. It does get to be a lot. We've only done 7 in 4 years. That's because it's a year-long process. It also depends on how long the route is. So our Inglewood, I think that was longer than Sugar Creek. That's the longest one we've done so far, and that's about a half a mile. And that took us, once we got good at IDing plants, let me caveat. The first couple ones you do, you're really getting your ID down and it takes a lot longer, but once you know what you're looking at, and once you do 1 or 2 quadrants, most of the other quadrants are the same stuff. So I think that one took about 2 days per season to do a full survey. So it is kind of time intensive, and if we have multiple trail surveys in the season, it does take a lot of time, but we're, also at the point where if a proposal is given to us and we can't handle it, we'll just say, this has gotta wait a couple months or a couple seasons for us to be able to start that proposal.